spring 1982. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had been in power for nearly 3 years. An economic recession and high unemployment had split the party and the country, and her domestic rating was at its lowest. But then an unexpected and distant war saw her popularity soar. Victory in the Falklands transformed Mrs. Thatcher's flagging fortune. It sealed her reputation as the Iron Lady. In time, it would secure her a second term in office. But why did Britain fight to save the fate of a sparsely populated and far-flung protectorate? The Falklands lie 300 miles east of the Argentine coast. Britain had occupied and administered the island since 1833 and had consistently rejected all claims to sovereignty by Argentina. But by 1966, this anomalous possession became the subject for successive British governments to explore if, with the right conditions attached, a different status could be negotiated.
It was quite obvious at that time that the Argentinians were getting rather impatient. We came up with the idea of the leaseback. But of course, the problem with the leaseback was, first of all, that the right wing of the Conservative Party felt outraged that any bit of British territory should be ceded, even if there was a 200-year leaseback. And the Labour Party, the left wing of the Labour Party, they were outraged that you should cede any British territory to a right-wing dictator. And the sensible people in the middle didn't make any noise at all. And so you were left at that time with nothing to negotiate with.
With progress stalled, the Falklands issue slipped down the political agenda. And although by early 1982 General Galtieri was making increasingly bellicose noises regarding reclaiming the Malvinas, and there had been 2 incursions into South Georgia, the response of the British government was limited.
We'd obviously discussed the Falklands. We discussed the antics of that group that went down to South Georgia, allegedly to collect scrap. But none of us seriously thought that the Argentinians would invade. That was, to the best of my recollection, that was never really on the agenda. We thought there might be a blockading or a tightening up, but I don't recall people saying the Argentinians are going to invade.
So when on Friday the 2nd of April 1982, Argentina did invade the Falklands, it caught most people by surprise. But with hindsight, almost everyone could point to the warning signs.
People felt that probably we didn't react as fast and firmly. I'm not sure what we could do, because South Georgia is about 800 miles out from the Falklands. But I think there was a feeling that we hadn't reacted as violently as we ought to have done when Steptoe and Son from Latin America landed on South Georgia and started dismantling the whaling station. They came back again too. And so my problem was that people were prepared to lay the charge at me in lobby briefings that you brought it on yourself.
The government too had been given specific warning of an invasion only 2 days earlier.
The Ministry of Defence view, as retailed by John Knott, was that before it, if they are taken, then they cannot be recovered. Well, Mrs. Thatcher wondered what on earth, what kind of Ministry of Defence they got. I mean, she was pretty grumpy about that. There's no way to start a problem, is it? And then, after the invasion had occurred, Admiral Leach, I think he was Chief of the Naval Staff, was summoned to a meeting in her room at the house. He couldn't find it. He was in mufti, so he was briefly detained by the authorities. But when a whip got him to Margaret Thatcher's room, she said, well, what can you do? I can assemble a task force in 48 hours. Well, you know, it's not the best start to recovering the Falklands to have a Minister of Defence saying you can't, and the Chief of the Naval Staff saying, I'm going to send a task force. I mean, really, it was comic. You could argue that it's pretty comic, actually, tragic comedy.
So, just 3 days after the invasion, on the 5th of April, a task force set sail for the South Atlantic. Parliament had been informed of the plan during an emergency session 2 days before. It was a difficult time for Mrs. Thatcher, but if she feared arguing the case for action in the Commons, she was mistaken. MPs of all parties were outraged, and the House was almost unanimous in backing the government.
The most stirring speech, call to arms, literally, against Galtieri and his fascist government, was made by Michael Foot. It was clear from the first minutes that the Labour Party would be relentless in its opposition to Galtieri and to the invasion.
As Mrs. Thatcher would later recall in her memoirs, her announcement of the task force being ready to sail was greeted with growls of approval.
The atmosphere was indescribable. I mean, the tension, the electricity, the shame, if you like, that it had occurred, the anger, especially, I think, from opposition benches, absolute anger that this had occurred, and yet a determination, as evinced by Michael Foot, that we've got to get him off.
On the same day the task force set sail, the Foreign Secretary resigned.
I didn't anticipate at that time there was going to be an invasion, because all the intelligence that I was getting was that the Argentinians wouldn't do anything until they'd been to the United Nations and exhausted all the procedures there. And of course that was wrong. I mean, I don't particularly blame the intelligence people, because I mean, how you know people's intentions? how do you gauge that? Perhaps there is a moral that which could be perhaps thought of in current circumstances, that you shouldn't rely too much on intelligence.
The speed at which the task force had been assembled was astounding. Extensive television coverage of its departure from Portsmouth gave the impression both of military strength and a proud nation prepared to fight to regain its lawful territory. But military action in difficult conditions 8,000 miles from home had to be a last option. Mrs. Thatcher knew diplomacy must come first.
Margaret Thatcher had a very ambivalent attitude to the Foreign Office. As an institution, she was immensely suspicious of it. She thought, I've always felt she was a little harsh on them, that diplomacy was a sort of form of appeasement. You know, that the question, you were looking for a way around a problem, and you might have to surrender something to get what you wanted. So she was always suspicious of the institution, but she admired individuals. And one of the people she admired particularly was Tony Parsons at the UN, who contrived to get UN support for a resolution which became almost the basis of our future action.
Next began a long and tiring round of shuttle diplomacy by US Secretary of State Al Haig.
All the diplomatic efforts, including Al Haig's, were to leave them there and to avoid a war, avoid a counter-invasion, if you like. And really, the story of the first phase of the campaign, if you like, while the fleet is steaming south, is all kinds of meddlers around the world trying to achieve a compromise in which the Argentine remain in charge of the islands. Well, it was never on. And I mean, the British public wouldn't have tolerated that.
The task force arrived at Ascension Island in the South Atlantic on the 16th of April. 9 days later, on the 25th of April, South Georgia was recaptured. News of the event was delivered by John Knott to the press gathered outside Downing Street.
The commander of the operation has sent the following message. Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen.
What happens next, Mr. Knott?
Thank you very much.
What's your reaction, Prime
Rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Are we going
Good
to
night,
declare war on
gentlemen.
Argentina, Mrs. Thatcher?
All kinds of people said that this was not an appropriate response. Well, I've never understood what would be a more appropriate response. And yet all we got them with virtually no loss of life, as far as I know. We'd recovered them. We weren't going to moan, were we? She couldn't conceivably say, moan, moan. No, I mean, really, I think people who wanted to take a bite out of her just would pick on anything and rejoice was a reason to have a go at her, but I've never understood it.
Diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict were getting nowhere. In a series of interviews on April the 30th, President Reagan backed Britain's right to take back the Falklands. If there was any remaining hope for a diplomatic solution, that ended with the sinking of the Belgrano on May the 2nd, with the loss of 368 crew.
We knew they were up to no good, and they believed that the 25th of May, cruiser I think it was, and the Belgrano were, whatever they were doing and wherever they were steaming at the moment, were involved in a pincer movement. And therefore the decision was given to sink it. And it sank. And there were 300 or more Argentinian lives lost. Now you don't rejoice at the loss of life, but you do rejoice at the elimination of a battleship that could place the lives of your troops and sailors and airmen in very serious jeopardy.
2 days later, the task force suffered its first heavy casualty, with the sinking of HMS Sheffield and the loss of 21 lives.
We feel deep sorrow for the loss of our ship, for which we had great affection. We feel considerable anger that we were struck in the first place. We feel particularly frustration that we're not still fighting alongside the task force.
We're talking about seconds to react rather than minutes. And I'm sure you will appreciate that a missile which comes in less than 12 feet off the deck at very high speed, many hundreds of miles an hour, gives us a very short time of response. And we saw it at a stage at which there was really no time to do anything other than for those who were in the immediate vicinity of the small number of people who saw this missile appearing, only had time to say take cover. And we're talking about 3 or 4 seconds later, the missile striking HMS Sheffield.
The loss of life had a profound effect on the Prime Minister.
It did upset her, but she never wavered at all. I mean, and this was what the military had been very worried about. How will she react to something like the Sheffield, you know, if it happens? Well, I mean, she was deeply upset, but it never affected her judgment or her determination.
The Tory party chairman, Mr. Cecil Parkinson, had warned earlier, we are approaching a decisive phase in the crisis.
On Tuesday the 18th of May, the War Cabinet met with all the Chiefs of Staff, and a decision was taken to go ahead with a landing on the Falklands, subject to Cabinet approval. The day we took the decision to go in, Pérez de Cuellar, the UN Secretary-General, said, the Argentinians are hopeless. The British have done everything that could be expected of them. I can do no more. Well, from that moment, that was the moment. From then on, it was up to us to choose the time. And so we didn't want to keep our troops bouncing around on ships, so the decision was taken to go in.
Did we we really expect to suffer such casualties? 4 ships sunk in as many days and as many again damaged.
On May the 21st, British troops landed at San Carlos, but then came under enemy fire from the air. The frigate HMS Ardent was lost. Another frigate, HMS Argonaut, and a destroyer, HMS Brilliant, were both badly damaged.
Her decks were packed with vehicles and munitions, and deep inside her were 2 unexploded bombs.
The loss of ships was a blow, but the first objective was achieved. 5,000 men had safely landed. The landing also brought to an end Britain's preparedness to negotiate.
We've tried, but they're not going to get off of their own volition, therefore they have to be removed. The real difficulty would have been if we'd have had severe losses when they were landing. But another miracle was that they got 5,000 odd troops ashore with scarcely a casualty.
Now, fully committed to military action, on the 27th of May, the troops moved in on Goose Green, and the battle was fierce.
At first light, the full extent of the horror of the fighting became apparent. The thick gorse that had hidden Argentine bunkers was still ablaze or smoking after what had been a furious battle.
With Argentine surrender came freedom for the people of Goose Green, who'd been imprisoned inside their community hall for 3 weeks. Both sides took casualties. Many of the troops sustained injury and several lost their lives, including one of the more famous casualties of the war, Colonel H. Jones, the commander of 2 Para, who lost his life in securing the way forward for his troops. He was buried along with his men.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain Dent, Lieutenant Barry.
As military action intensified, so once again the Americans tried to revive diplomatic negotiations. At the same time, UN Secretary-General Javier Pérez de Cuellar advanced a 5-point peace plan. There were calls for a ceasefire.
I don't think Mrs. Thatcher, after the initial fumbling and great doubt and deep natural concern, I don't think that she contemplated continuation of any dual track. We were going to war, and the faster we went to war, the better. I know that her view was not unanimously shared amongst senior responsible officers, but to their credit, they're not inclined to refuse the political will of a democratically elected government.
In the Falklands, preparations were being made for the final assault on Port Stanley. Support troops, equipment and ammunition had been moved from San Carlos to Bluff Cove and Fitzroy, from where soldiers would advance on the capital. Before the operation was complete, however, the British troops were subject to devastating attack by the Argentines.
The Skyhawks came in to attack and were out again with our gunfire chasing them too late. So sudden, so unannounced, we knew nothing until we saw the black smoke billowing out of the landing ship, Sir Galahad, and then the first signs of a fire aboard St. Tristram nearby. The attack happened so fast, there wasn't even time to think of taking cover. And as the ships were hit, many men aboard hadn't even time to pull on their anti-burn masks to save themselves from the heat flash as the bombs exploded. The 2 landing ships, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, were bombed within 200 yards of each other as they were unloading supplies of ammunition and of men. The bombs hit Sir Galahad aft through the engine room and accommodation sections. I watched from the shore less than 400 yards away and felt the impact on the ground below me as the hold full of ammunition exploded. Many were brought ashore with dreadful burns.
Hey, you must spread down, lads. Thin out a bit.
Bullets came from their ammunition boxes, exploding in the heat, whistling and whirring past us.
The brutal reality of war made a deep impression on Mrs. Thatcher.
to have the kind of blow that the Welsh Guards took at Bluff was a pretty awful thing. But you see, you are leader of the nation. You have to show tremendous reserves of fortitude in these circumstances. And there's no good going to pieces. That won't do anybody any good, least of all the survivors. So you have, some people will say you have to put on a front. But you have to demonstrate that you are a leader in these circumstances, because that's what you are.
In the days that followed, a military bombardment of Argentinian positions prepared the way for the final push for Port Stanley.
From the Two Sisters, the Royal Marines treaded their way carefully down the pass, but the route was blocked by minefields, and every few minutes the column dragged to a halt as the way was carefully cleared.
Once the military campaign started to roll, it was out of our hands. Then it was a question where our soldiers, better than theirs, could they prevail, and of course they did. But we were, to an extent, from that moment, once the campaign really started to roll, we were getting reports rather than influencing events at all.
On the 14th of June, the Argentines surrendered. White flags were flying over Port Stanley.
It was, I think, a very considerable feat of arms to go all that way, 8,000 miles, and defeat a power which had, a navy of its own, had an air force of its own, all the rest of it. So I think in military terms, it was perhaps a little bit kind of nostalgic, but it was nonetheless a considerable achievement.
That evening, back in London, Margaret Thatcher went to the House of Commons and, on a point of order, announced the victory. Cheers resounded throughout the House, and outside in Whitehall and Downing Street, the crowds greeted Mrs. Thatcher as the conquering hero.
She always had this Joan of Arc capacity to know that what she was doing was right, and I don't think that she probably doubted for a moment that it was going to come out successfully in the end. I think she must have known that she had a lot more windier colleagues who were much more apprehensive, but I think that she obviously did feel vindicated when it was all over.
Within days of the Argentine surrender, General Galtieri and his military junta were removed from power. Democracy was restored to Argentina in 1983.
There had always been quite a close sort of Anglo-Argentine relationship, and I don't think it devastated it. Obviously, there were people who were grateful to Thatcher for the overthrow of the dictatorship, and a lot of people lost their lives, disappeared ones and all that, and without, I think, our defence of the Falklands, the junta would not have been overthrown. So there may be even people in the Argentine who actually are grateful for what we did.
When on the 21st of July, the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes arrived back home, laden with troops and helicopters, Mrs. Thatcher was the first to greet them. In congratulating all on board on their triumph, she was celebrating her own.
Oh, don't photograph me, that's a scoreboard. Look at that, that's a scoreboard of achievement.
I think they recognise that they got a quite exceptional woman here. I think they realised it, or were beginning to realise it, before the Falklands, notwithstanding the huge increase in unemployment. But I think they were beginning to realise that there was something of exceptional quality in this woman. After the Falklands, they knew.
This is the most fantastic operation that we've undertaken. We're all very privileged to have taken part in it. And I couldn't have her coming in without coming to welcome her.
The public, too, was keen to celebrate the safe return of our boys.
There was just a feeling of admiration for the job that our troops and our airmen and sailors had done. I mean, to operate 8,500 miles from home with your nearest land base 4,500 miles away, and to be successful was an astonishing feat of arms, and people were hugely impressed by the professionalism and the skill and the bravery of our forces.
7 months after the war had ended, Mrs. Thatcher paid her own visit to the Falklands.
Oh, this is lovely. This is a typical house.
This is typical size.
Typical size house.
It was her first visit to the islands and an opportunity to meet the people for whom she had risked her political future and the lives of many British servicemen and women.
To maintain peace with freedom and justice is always expensive. It's less expensive than war, particularly in human life.
Might there be a time when we talk to the Argentines again?
No, not on sovereignty. One thing the islanders have made it perfectly clear. These islands are British. They are the Queen's loyal subjects. They wish it to stay that way.
The Falklands had a huge impact on Margaret Thatcher. She didn't become arrogant, but they gave a real boost to her self-confidence because, you know, she must have had her doubts. First woman Prime Minister, going to war, heading up a war cabinet. And she handled it, and she handled it brilliantly, and she came out of it with a lot of unlikely admirers, like virtually the whole of our forces.
Margaret Thatcher's popularity was at its height. Her triumph was the result of political nerve and enormous good luck. Her military success would later guarantee her a second term in office. But perhaps most significantly, it would increase Mrs. Thatcher's confidence in her own judgment, her own sense of being right. She was now unassailable. In the next programme, how Margaret Thatcher bestrode the world stage and the truth about that special relationship.
You can order Margaret Thatcher a tribute in words and pictures for the special half-price fee of £10. Call Telegraph Books on 0870 155 7222 or order online at www.books.telegraph.co.uk.